Um, Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone else. Welcome to the Government Finance Officers Association's training on financial foundations for thriving communities, putting it all together. This webinar is approximately 2 hours in length and is worth 2 continuing professional education credits based on a 50-minute hour. All participants' connections have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them using the Q&A feature on the pane on the right side of your screen. At the conclusion of the event, you will be redirected to a short survey to evaluate the content of today's presentation. Finally, CPE certificates will be sent to all paid participants in the mail in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. So with that introductory information out of the way, we're going to go ahead and jump in to our presentation for today. So again, this is, we are talking about Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities, which is a GFOA, one of GFOA's new initiatives. We're going to be talking about how you can put it all together. So this initiative is made up of 5 pillars, and we are going to kind of talk about how these 5 pillars come together. So today's presenters, we have with us Chris Adams, who's the president of Balancing Act, which is a firm that provides local government with tools for transparency, accountability, and participation. We also have with us Michael Bryant. He's the management and budget director from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And we also have with us Matt Lentz, who's the chief financial officer from the Upper Moreland School District in Pennsylvania. My name is Katie Ludwig. I'm a senior manager here at GFOA. I've been with GFOA for just over a year, and prior to that I worked in the city of Chicago and also at the Chicago Housing Authority. So before we jump into our presentation and our conversation for today, I just want to give you all a brief overview of the Financial Foundations framework. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and I am going to apologize ahead of time, I am getting over a sinus infection, so I'm a little bit nasally and I might be coughing a little bit, so forgive me for that. But I wanted to talk about why GFOA developed this framework, and really that is because we heard from our members that this was something they were concerned about. So in fact, in our last member survey, 7 of the top 10 concerns that members listed had something to do with maintaining a strong financial foundation, financial sustainability, things like that. So we were really hearing from our members that this is something that was concerning them, and as a result we thought, well, we need to give them some tools to help figure this out and help them. So why do we think this framework is helpful? Why do we think this framework works and helps people? So there's a couple different reasons for that. But the first thing is that it really does make finance everyone's business. And so we really feel pretty strongly that because everyone is involved in using financial resources, that everyone needs to be involved in solidifying them and strengthening them. And so this means not just internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders. And really the framework gets at that. It kind of outlines strategies for how you can get others involved in strengthening your organization's finances. And so on that same note, it really does go beyond the numbers. So we all know that accounting records don't tell the whole story of a given organization. And quite in fact, sometimes the numbers, figuring out the numbers are the easy part, and what's the hard part is figuring out how to get people to cooperate, how to get them involved. And this framework does that. It really goes beyond just the numbers and really does give you tools and strategies you can use to kind of work with people, which are often harder than numbers sometimes. It's also based on really accurate models of behavior. It's compatible with findings in behavioral sciences. We have a book coming out on the framework that talks, and it has a lot of case studies, talks in greater detail about the research on which the framework is based. But the point is, we didn't just make this stuff up. It's really based on theories that have been tested and verified. So again, there's some science to back it up. And finally, it works. So as I said, we have lots of case studies, but it's demonstrated by real governments. Some of them you will hear from today. Again, if you read the book, we have lots more in there. We're also developing white papers, and those will be available soon on our website. But really, it does work. So I want to talk a little bit about what this framework is. And so I'm going to take a step back and talk for a second about the research on which the framework is based. So you see here in front of you this lovely drawing of this sort of this grazing area, this pasture. And so you might say, Katie, what has this got to do with the Financial Foundations framework? So I'm going to explain that to you. So the research that the framework is based on is it's a body of research that was developed by Dr. Elinor Ostrom. And Dr. Ostrom, by the way, was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And the body of research that she developed is called Common Pool Resource Theory. And so a perfect example of a common pool resource is, in fact, this grazing area. So it's jointly owned and shared by all 4 farmers there. So they all have an individual incentive to graze their animals on that as much as possible, right? Because if the sheep farmer doesn't do it, well, then the goat farmer is going to, and he's going to miss out. The problem is, if everyone does that and just goes with their own individual incentive, everyone loses out, right? Now we have this really sad picture of all the animals starving, and the grazing area is grazed down to nothing. So the farmers need to develop a framework. They need to develop some tools, a system to jointly manage that grazing area, that shared resource, that common pool resource. So when you think about it, another really good example of a common pool resource is, in fact, your community's budget, a local government's finances, its budget. So you can see the same thing, if we don't have a system in place to manage these resources, everyone will take as much as they can get for their individual needs or causes, and in the long term, the whole community suffers. So really, the Financial Foundation framework is a system that GFOA has developed to help local governments manage these resources more effectively. So first, I'm right now going to share with you this video. Oh, well, I was going to share this video with you. I'm not able to do that, but I'm just going to jump in then to the framework itself, which is, so you see we have these 5 pillars here before us, and so in a second I'm going to go through all these 5 pillars, but as you can see from the graphic, they are very interconnected. So when you build up one and you strengthen one, you're really kind of strengthening all of them. So the framework also includes, and under each pillar we have leadership strategies and institutional design principles. So I'm going to explain what those are. So the leadership strategies, those are things, because we can't just make people do things, we have to work with them, right? And we have to get them to do things that will make the organization more financially sustainable. So these are things that I personally, or that you personally as a leader, as an individual, can do within your organization. So as opposed to the institutional design principles, those are more characteristics of the organization, things that need to be put in place within your organization. And the reason these are important are because, leaders come and go, and we all know that no one, we may all work in organizations, and we're not going to be there forever. And we would like, for the work that we've done today, to still make a difference in the future. And so I think it's really important that as leaders, we put in place some of these institutional design principles to make sure that even after we leave, that the good work we've done in the organizations is still there and still making a difference. So again, we'll keep talking about these different leadership strategies and institutional design principles. So I'm going to go through each of the pillars briefly here. And the first pillar of the framework is what we call establish a long-term vision. And so we have two leadership strategies. We have that leaders need to promote collaboration, and leaders need to balance long-term goals with short-term needs. Something you'll hear me say a lot is that it's really important to think of all of these leadership strategies and design principles in relation to both internal and external stakeholders. So we have to promote collaboration internally, so among different teams, among different groups, among different people, but also externally, so amongst our different stakeholder groups, our constituents, advocates, maybe just other stakeholder groups that we might have. Sometimes we have unions or again, advocacy groups, things like that. And then balancing the long-term goals with the short-term needs. What we're saying there is that we have to remember, people often respond to things in the short term, but we have to keep the long term in mind. And that's sometimes really hard to do, but really we have to give people a picture, a vision for the future that we have to provide to give them motivation, a reason why they should be working together. So another important thing to remember is that this vision for the future shouldn't be a vision for how you want your organization, how you want your local government to look, or how you want it to function. It really needs to be a vision of what everyone, how all stakeholders want for the entire community. I think a lot of the times as local governments, we come up with our vision statement. What we're really talking about is how we want the government itself, the organization itself to function, but really local governments exist to serve the community. So we need to be thinking about a community vision and what we can be doing to get the community to thrive, not just the organization. So I'm going to move on to pillar number 2, which is build trust and open communication. Again, we have two leadership strategies here. So we talk about creating open lines of communication and cultivating trustworthy reputations. Personally, I think this is probably the most difficult and as well as the most important pillar, because personally I think when trust breaks down, people lose faith in their democracy and they just stop participating. So I personally, for me in my experience, I do think this is one of the hardest to establish and really, really important. So we're going to be talking a lot about this in a bit with our presenters, but in terms of open lines of communication, it's really important as leaders. We have to create and promote channels to connect stakeholders, and we have to be open to hearing them and communicating back and forth with them. Can't just be, one-way communication. It really has to be that two-way communication. And then when we talk about trust, really we at GFOA, trust is everything for us here. We think some ways you can build trust are through transparency, but at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that you have to say what you mean what you say, and then follow through. And again, we're going to talk about this some more in a little bit and give you all some tips for how that can, how you can build that trust. I'm going to move on to pillar number 3, which is use collective decision making. So here we have a leadership strategy, which is engage key stakeholders, and then we have 2 institutional design principles. We talk about collective choice arrangements and networked enterprises. So under engage key stakeholders, I think we're all kind of familiar with that, right? We talk about engagement. And again, I want to point out again that we're not talking just about internal stakeholders, but external stakeholders as well. And when we're talking about external stakeholders, I think a lot of us say like, oh yeah, I engage with my external stakeholders. We do public hearings all the time. I think when we're talking about engaging people, we really need to start thinking about going beyond just the traditional public hearing. We want to allow people to voice their concerns, get their feedback, and then adjust as needed. And I think, again, too often in the traditional model public hearings, it's just kind of that one-way communication, which is really not what we're talking about. We want to take that to the next level. And again, you'll hear more about this in a little bit and give you all some strategies that you can use to really take what you're doing today to the next level. But again, those institutional design principles, those things that your organization needs to have in place, we again talk about collective choice arrangements. Again, this is just giving people a voice in how resources are used, that you have things in place to allow them to do that. And again, going beyond just your traditional public hearings. And then networked enterprises. What we talk about there, what we're really meaning are sort of collaborative, cross-sector networks where people can pool resources to address community challenges. So I know a lot of communities across the country today are facing really big problems. We all have, we've heard a lot about things like homelessness, opioid addiction, climate change, all these kinds of sort of really big problems that maybe one organization on its own can't really fix or solve. And so we've come up with this term networked enterprises to talk about how local governments can work together with either other local governments or with maybe nonprofit organizations to sort of build a coalition that can then address those problems collectively. Because it's more effective that way, because again, one organization on its own can't really make a dent in some of those really big problems. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit as well. But moving along to pillar number 4, which is create clear rules. And the leadership strategy we have here is to maintain oversight. And then we have a few different institutional design principles there. So within your organization, you need to have well-defined boundaries, you need to have a system to monitor, and then you also need to have a system of sanctions and rewards. When we talk about maintaining oversight, what we're really trying to get at here is that you have to reinforce the importance of cooperation and making sure that people don't forget that, and really how one way that you can do that is by encouraging a culture of shared values and letting everyone know and getting them to understand why the collaboration is so important. Again, it needs to sort of become ingrained in the organization. The institutional design principles, again, we talk about the well-defined boundaries. Really what this is why you have to set up rules for the game. And when everyone knows the rules of the game, everyone's set up to win then, and they can, you can't hold people accountable if you haven't set the rules or set what the boundaries are. So we at GFOA are big believers in that your financial policies are often the way you set those boundaries for your financial resources, how financial decisions are being made. That should often all be laid out in your financial policies. That should be clear to everyone, should be transparent. Decisions shouldn't be made sort of in a black box and people don't understand how those decisions are being made. They need to be more transparent. And then finally, the monitoring, that's really about, holding people accountable. And sanctions and rewards, we're talking there about sort of incentives for doing the right things and disincentives, or, sort of how you can disincentivize people from doing the wrong thing. The other thing we talk about here is also sometimes people do the wrong thing because that's easier, so you have to remove the barriers to doing the right thing. So we'll talk more about that hopefully in a little bit. But again, those sanctions and rewards can be pretty powerful in terms of getting people to stay within the boundaries there that you've established through your financial policies. Okay, finally, excuse me, again, we're talking about pillar number 5, which is treat everyone fairly. And so here we have some institutional design principles. We have proportional equivalence between benefits and costs, which you're going, whoa, that's a lot of big words there. What are we talking about there? What we're really getting at here is that people, taxpayers, they get what they pay for and they pay for what they get. And it's not only that there's that equivalence there, but that it's that people understand that. So it's one thing that, you know, if that proportional equivalence exists, that's great, but it's also that you need to be really clear with people and they need to understand what they are getting for their tax dollars. And again, you can see this to me is a perfect example of why clear communication is so important. And because you might say, oh yeah, I know, we've taken a look and all our taxes and our fees and fines and, you know, it's all fair, it's all good. But if people don't understand that and don't understand where their tax dollars are going, don't understand where, how you've derived your fines and your fees and things like that, if they don't understand that, they tend to be a little bit more mistrustful. So this is also where a lot of kind of a trend right now in local government is a lot of local governments are putting in place sort of equity offices or equity initiatives, and a lot of those conversations kind of are related to this proportional equivalence. So we've talked about that a little bit in some previous webinars. The other two design principles that we talk about are conflict resolution mechanisms and the minimum recognition of rights. In terms of conflict resolution mechanisms, what we mean there is that it's really important. We know that not everyone is going to be happy with all the decisions that we make as local government leaders. We need to anticipate that there will be disagreements, there will be disputes, but we need to prevent those conflicts from being destructive and really promote constructive conversation, constructive debate. So we talk a lot about some of the concepts of procedural justice and how that can be really helpful. The point is that just anticipating, again, that there will be disputes and disagreement and having some sort of system in place to address those disagreements. Again, there's lots of different models out there, but we just think that it's important to anticipate those and know that you're going to need to have some tough conversations. And finally, we talk about minimum recognition of rights, and what we mean there is minimum recognition of the autonomy of the local government, particularly as it relates to state and federal government. And in particular, what we think that local governments need to have policies and procedures in place to protect against unfunded mandates and to manage grants effectively. So again, we all know that often from the state and or federal government, we have these unfunded mandates that come down that can really affect us in some pretty significant financial ways. And same with grants. Sometimes, you know, we don't know what we're applying for when we apply for grants, and you get those grant agreements and you realize that they've come with all these strings attached that often don't make them nearly as attractive. I always say there's no such thing, right, as like free grant money. It's always comes with some strings attached, so you need to understand those very well before you even apply. Okay, so we are going to get started in just a minute with a conversation. So we have, again, our other three presenters here, and we are going to talk with them. They all have experience sort of in implementing different parts of this framework, and we're going to be talking with them, getting their feedback on how these pillars kind of all come together and their advice on sort of tips, things that we can all do in our own local government. Before we jump into that conversation, though, we have a couple of questions to sort of test your knowledge here, see how closely you were paying attention. So our question number one was, who developed the Nobel Prize-winning research on which the Financial Foundation's framework is based? So we have four choices here. We have A, Gary Becker, B, Eleanor Ostrom, C, Milton Friedman, or D, Janet Yellen? So if you all will just take a second there and respond to the question. Okay, the poll closed. It's just calculating it. Let's see how everybody did there. Oh, yay. Most people got it right. Okay, so yes, the correct answer was B, Eleanor Ostrom. And remember, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. So she's kind of a personal hero of mine. But great. I'm glad that most of you all got that one. Next question for right now is, which of the following is not a strategy associated with pillar number 1, establish a long-term vision? So not a strategy. So is it A, open lines of communication, B, promote collaboration, or C, balance long-term goals with short-term needs? All right, again, most of you all got this correct. The correct answer is A, open lines of communication. So the two strategies under pillar number 1 are promote collaboration and balance long-term goals with short-term needs. I did think this was a bit of a tricky one because the open lines of communication is part of pillar number 2, and they are very much related, but good question. So I'm glad to see that most of you all got that right. About 39% of people chose A. So good job, folks. So we are going to jump into our conversation, our discussion here today amongst all our presenters. Again, GFOA, we really think this is a useful tool that local governments can use and to put themselves in a better financial position for the future. But we know that our members are often pulled in a million different directions and might not have a lot of time to think through how to put something like this in action. So one thing we'd like to accomplish today is to give our listeners, our members, some advice on steps that they can take to implement different parts of the framework. So we're going to kind of talk through that with our presenters today. And we're going to start with that pillar number 1. So we're starting with talking about establishing a long-term vision. And often when we talk about establishing a long-term vision, I think one way we do that is by doing multi-year forecasting. But Matt, I'm wondering if you can get us started and kind of talk about other examples for implementing a long-term vision that other than just multi-year forecasting. So things that maybe you've done, if you want to talk about that.
Sure, Kate, that's great. So yeah, I think when you look at a long-term vision, we often think, well, that's our long-range financial plan. And I think in thinking about the pillar, it really is a breakdown of all those components that can go into your long-range financial plan. So if you advance to slide 20, I kind of mapped out the pieces that go into a long-range financial plan to start with. So the first, obviously, you would have your multi-year capital improvements plan and program. The next piece is really be your replacement cycles. Now, when we think of replacement cycles, it's not just vehicles and infrastructure. It's also what's your plan for technology. And so in looking at a long-term vision, each of those areas and or departments have to identify what the vision ahead is for them, and then how that ties into the long-range plan for the organization. I think additionally, with regards to a long-range plan that's non-financial, that looks at a long-term vision, there's things to consider such as succession planning, looking at and identifying within your organization's own individuality and resources the ability that you may have to address changes that you know are on the horizon, either with regards to the inability to recruit or hire individuals from a workforce, and or with individuals that you know will be phasing out their years of service to your organization. I think the next is really how do we have a long-term vision with regards to issues that are just out there. You think of now potentially starting to run scenarios on, well, what if there is a recession in the near future? What if there's not? And I think having a plan as to, well, what does that timing look like? What are we going to do to act? How do we kind of gauge the temp? So an example of that gauging the temp would be, how do we look at within our vision that if we weren't able to if we had to knock off some of our goals for budget reasons, what would that be? What would the tolerance be of our community to lose something that they know and touch? So, for example, as a school entity, and we're a school entity, serving K-12, we also service our municipalities, park, recreation, and community. So it would be whether we can sustain having buildings open, heated, cooled in times when we aren't in session, purely for the sake of having recreational activities and facilities, because that is a fairly significant cost based upon the size and scope of our facilities. But what would be the interest in that? There may be no interest because individuals feel that that's one way that they are connected to us as an entity, even if we do not have students of theirs attending to us on a daily basis. There may be other people who say, well, it's nice, but I would rather that be cut than you reduce the transportation, busing services for students who attend, every day. And then I think the final piece is within developing a long-range, vision, that you really look at, what your, keys to success are, and kind of when you've hit that you're doing something, very well. The sky's the limit on any big plan or broad-based vision, but also at some point it can't overtake, an organization. And so you have to understand when you've done enough, you've done a good enough job with that. We had an example of a community input committee I'll talk about a little later, hopefully in the presentation. But out of that committee, community members really became strongly empowered and interested in further developing our field and park and rec facilities, so to speak, with our tennis courts and turf and multiple turf fields and additional fields that are all available for community use. And, we kind of had to, complete that project, but then taper them down because there was such an interest. I think we were headed towards a focus on, very high-end, maintenance needs and experience, which was not part of our core vision. And that kind of ties into the bottom part of the slide about assessing. For me in my sector, I'm a governmental entity, but I'm primarily a K-12 school district, and that's what I'm staffed for. That's what my staff are skilled in. And if, we are meeting that need, certainly our staff need to have appropriate skills and feedback and be responsive to that. So it's a learning curve for them to learn, what it means to, have overlap activities and things like that, but that they are really effective at taking feedback, responding, and, also relative to other competitions. We have private, athletic facilities, and or the fact that, this is a revenue source for us as a school entity. If we don't do it and our township decided to do it, well, then we're going to lose that revenue stream, and it's going to have an adverse impact on us as an organization.
Thank you. That's super helpful. In terms of developing the long-term vision, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about that, particularly when it relates to sort of those future issues. How how do we know what lies ahead and what should be considered? Like, what are some of the things, right? You sort of feel like sometimes you're looking into this crystal ball, and how do you know what you should be looking at, what you should be considering? Like, tell us some of the things that maybe you take into consideration there.
Sure. So we do, we do surveys on various specific initiatives to try to gauge interest. What we actually do is we do, things such as climate surveys, both internal and external, through that process. I also think that we look, as a government entity, we look to what other entities are doing with regards to, generating fee-for-service revenue, what other kind of schools within our sector are pursuing with regards to, a benchmarking, and then tying that all back to our initial strategic plan. Our entity's strategic plan has 4 goals. That's it. And, in this day and age, one of those goals is always, financial transparency and, financial stewardship. But under those, goals, we have the ability to adapt on a yearly basis. What does that mean? And so we really establish those goals. We utilize them over a 6-year period, and then tie objectives and other strategic initiatives into those goals that are clearly articulated to, our board and to our community. Also, that we have the opportunity for community feedback sessions, input, and that we expand our reporting out also not just to be with regards to, those milestones, but for example, in the financial stewardship, we're really facing, based upon our union agreements, a real pinch on the benefit side of meeting medical and prescription coverage. And so, not just waiting for the strategic planning milestones, but that we provide, benchmark data prepared both at, day-to-day meetings with our labor groups, both at our board level at meetings, even just as informational to help them to gauge kind of this pathway that, it's tough for individuals that are not directly connected with an organization to identify with a vision and then also see how that vision is unrolling. So using those as opportunities to assess, well, what's people's interest. So I talked recently at a board meeting about, changes we could potentially make to our prescription programs for savings. And, we haven't even proposed those to our union yet, but it got me a gauge of board members, many who said, we've had that in the private sector for 10 years. Okay, I know that there's going to be a better, acclimation to that. It also gave me, if I presented these, what other, individuals to me to say, well, have you looked at this? Have you looked at something else on this? Why are you picking these? These alternatives there. So that's a constant gauging and listening, even if an individual in government is, maybe, people often over communicate their opinions from an external side. There very often is a truth that you can, respond to, you can incorporate, and you can, use that to, if not develop, flesh out what your vision is.
Sure. No, thanks. That's really helpful. Actually, I wanted to ask one follow-up question. You mentioned your strategic plan. Does that have, I think you mentioned something about 6 years, but does your strategic plan have a time frame associated with it? I know some people have a 5-year strategic plan, a 3-year strategic plan, something like that. Does yours have a time frame associated with it?
Yeah. So we tie our strategic plan to our state requirements, which is a 6-year strategic plan with a 3-year mid-year review. But then we annually, as a district, as an entire entity, engage in developing what our, objectives, our other initiatives are for that plan on an annual basis, and then those then all tie down to, so if our, if an initiative, say for us, is to, we had, we implemented an entire alternative fuels fleet of vehicles, then that tied down to not only my goal, and then it tied to the, the fleet maintenance director that I supervise within our annual goals to then have benchmarks developed and then shared back out of that.
Okay, thanks. Very helpful. Again, I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions, There's that Q&A feature on the right hand of the pane, so you should feel free to type questions in. We can get to those during the presentation if something comes up, or we can definitely also get to them at the end as well. So just didn't want to forget about that. Okay, sorry, I thought I had seen a question, but I don't think so. Okay. All right. So let's move along maybe to pillar number 2, which again is building trust and communication. So Michael, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Like, why do you think building trust with your stakeholders is so important? And what are some of the ways that Mecklenburg County has worked to build trust with its stakeholders?
Sure, Katie. Before I respond to that, I want to take 30 seconds to go back and dovetail Matt's response regarding the what lies ahead and should be considered within the vision of long-term strategies. One of the things we've done here in Mecklenburg County is we created a position that's an economist that is housed in our finance department. And I tell you, it's been very beneficial to have someone that is an expert in that space. We also have that individual brief our board periodically throughout the year, including our annual budget retreat. And it is one of the highlights of that 3-day workshop. It helps add credibility by having a third party, if you will, opinion beyond just the finance office or budget staff or manager's office, and having someone that is an expertise, and recognizing that every organization is not in a position where they can dedicate a resource solely for that purpose. Prior to then, we would work with our local university here, UNC Charlotte, to provide us an economist and or the state university, and then also being in Charlotte, being one of the banking capitals of the world, Bank of America has an economist as well. So we've had a lot of benefits yielded from bringing in economists to also speak to our governing body and assist us with putting together our long-range financial plan. So I just wanted to go back and add that comment.
No, that's really helpful, and I think you're right. I think if your government were in a place to be able to hire someone, I think it's incredibly helpful. But I also liked how you pointed out that there are how before you were able to hire someone that you use these external resources. I think there's often universities, other sort of private entities. I think they're often more willing than we might think to kind of step up and provide feedback, provide some help in that way. So I'm glad you mentioned that as something that a local government could think about. So thank you.
No problem. Okay,
so talk to us about trust, and what do you think about why you think that's important, and how has Mecklenburg County worked to build trust?
Yeah, well, Katie, in your overview of the pillars, you noted this one as the most difficult one to establish. Also
I certainly
being
think so, yeah.
I could not agree more. And there's a couple of reasons why. Not only is it about creating and establishing trust, but it's also about maintaining it. It's a constant ongoing activity to maintain and establish trust, particularly as it relates to government and finance, because you can have trust today and then something can occur within your organization in a specific department, and the organization as a whole can lose its trust and credibility with the community that it serves. So public service, as I view it, it is a special trust, and the finance office play a very important role in public service. The finance office has stewardship, as we all know, over citizens' shared resources, and these resources make it possible for services to be provided to the community relative to safety, livability, and the volatility of our communities. Shane Cavanaugh, who is a staffer with GFOA, recently published an article in the August 2019 Government Finance Review, the publication by GFOA, regarding trust. And it references that stakeholders need to believe what they hear about government finances. If people are going to contribute their resources, such as taxes, of course, They need to trust those resources will be transformed into something of value. In the county, our efforts to build trust are all centered around the 5 elements of trustworthiness that's suggested by GFOA's Code of Ethics. And it starts with being honest and transparent. We have a couple of sayings here in Mecklenburg County towards establishing trust. That first one is confronting the brutal facts. And we put that out there a lot during the recession years when we had to be very transparent and open and make sure the community understand all of the facts, and we had to confront them. And then the second one is choices and consequences, because with every decision that you're making, there is a consequence. So you'll make sure you clearly articulate what that consequence is associated with the decision. And then governments, especially in finance, should have a zero tolerance towards unethical behavior. Talk about trying to maintain trust. You know, if your community views that something unethical is occurring within your organization, that is an instant loss of that trust, and it is very difficult to recover from that. And then also the deliverance of bad news, and you touched on this, Katie, as well, and that's being prompt, be straight, and provide solutions. It's one thing to identify what's going on, but you also want to offer solutions to the problem as well. And then there's something that I always resource to, and that's some examples of questions that differentiate ethical versus unethical behavior. And there's 3 questions, 3 easy questions that I ask myself. 1, is it legal? 2, is it immoral? And 3, will anyone be hurt? And then last but certainly not least, place the emphasis on customer service. And there's many ways you can do that. You know, Matt talked about a survey that he administered in his community. We also administer an annual community survey that touches on several areas of the county government. And one of the things we ask them, we inquire about, is our trust. You know, how would they rate their trust levels in their government? And we get that information forth, and for us, it's been, you know, fairly high as of late, but it's still very informative to get a good pulse check on your community as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, I'm done.
Oh, I just wanted to comment on that. I think the customer service piece, I think is really important, and I'm glad to hear you mention that. I think it's interesting because sometimes working in the finance office, we kind of forget that, I feel like, you know, because we're not on the front lines providing that direct service to our constituents. And so I think that sometimes we might forget that, oh yeah, we're here to serve those, the taxpayers at the end of the day. So I do think that sometimes we forget that, and it needs to be part of the culture that is set up. And so I was glad to hear you mention that, keeping that customer service mentality, right, or just keeping that in mind. And again, I think that's can be helpful too to kind of build that up in your organizational culture as well. So,
Very important.
Matt, I think, so it's one thing to build up trust, and I think organizations do a lot to build that trust up, and then that trust can be tested, right? Like things can come down and in sort of just one little thing in like a sandcastle, right? It just all crumbles and comes down. So, can you give us some tips or recommendations on how you would approach like rebuilding trust, like once it's been broken?
Yep.
I think it's a particularly tough one. So.
Yeah. So to Michael's point with regards to the critical piece of, maintaining that trust, organizations often see a cycle in which, there is a perceived loss of trust. And so I think, for example, we have faced it as an organization because of our numerous bargaining units that we serve. We have had negotiations where they have been rough, they've been rocky, they have been emotional. And, I think that what we've really seen and accepted within an organizational, design is that you will have those moments. And I think if you show up slide 21, you know, I think that the best things that you can continue to do is, you know, even during that period of which, you know, there seemed to be, you know, no trust between, you know, mutual parties during, you know, a recent negotiations we had, that, you know, we continued to talk, we continued to communicate, you know, we were, you know, then once we, you know, moved through kind of that rocky period and we're trying to, you know, make things better, you know, we, you know, I think both kind of admitted mistakes and then also said we don't want to go back to where we were, and then really started to do positive changes, really started to, you know, silo the issue at hand, which I think is a term that, you know, I've come up with regards to, you know, if it's that philosophy of that, if every day, you know, because somebody did something wrong, I think that they are not a good employee or they're incompetent, you know, I'm pretty soon going to run out of anyone that I can rely on within my organization. So to really look at it as it was a moment in time, and, you know, that you really just have to move forward as if it didn't happen, and show, you know, what, you know, you're able to, you know, move forward with from that. And so for us, you know, we did a campaign, you know, the year following that, which was, you know, really put out to all of our staff of very simply, you know, a soft skill of like words matter. And the whole point was not only for rebuilding the trust from negotiations and what might have been said, but also because our, you know, a large part of our constituents are students, that, you know, the way we frame something to somebody, you know, can impact them and be what their association is with that. And so really we're able to tie that rebuilding to a community rebuilding, a community refocus, which, you know, for us really helped us work through the period of transition and get through that perceived mistrust that we as an organization, you know, had and our labor group had of us after we went through those negotiations.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And I like your point on here about admitting mistakes as part of your communication. And I think that's a really important point and often is really hard for us, particularly given that, you know, we work in local government, and local governments are inherently political, and sometimes from a political standpoint, it's often hard to admit mistakes, right? And so I think admitting your mistake is really important for, again, building that trust, but I think sometimes it can be fraught with some challenges there. But I think I know, again, when I worked in local government, again, I worked for the Chicago Housing Authority, which has done great work, but is also doesn't have the best track record, or didn't, you know, when I was working there. And so it was important a lot of the times when I was communicating with our stakeholders that I had to kind of, even though if I hadn't played a part in some of the organization's former missteps, I still had to sort of own them and acknowledge them and say, hey, listen, we're going to try to get better. So, but I think ignoring them really didn't do us any help, didn't serve the larger purpose of trying to rebuild that trust. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So, Chris, I wanted to get to you, and I wanted to talk, you know, I do really feel like open communication really goes hand in hand with trust, and we've talked a lot about how really that communication is key to building trust. And so a growing trend in public finance is sort of creating greater financial transparency. I know Balancing Act has helped a lot of governments in this regard. So can you talk to us in sort of how you think, what you think makes financial transparency valuable, and how that relates back to trust?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you wouldn't mind going to slide 41,
sure.
Illustrate what I'm talking about. You know, one of the things that we try to do, we try to overcome a major barrier that is quite relevant to folks in government finance positions, is that budgets are really hard things to talk about. They're often very long, not just very long, but very, very long. Some entities, they're well over 1,000 pages. They're complex. They have a lot of math. In some ways, they're just sort of impenetrable to a lot of people who don't have this as their day job, and even some special skills and background. And so that to us, that's just a recipe for mistrust, and it can be both mistrust among the public, but it can also even be mistrust internally, even among people who do have some of those skills, just because it can often be seen as sort of a black box process. One of the things that I admire about GFOA and what it's been working on over the last many years, actually, and I'd say the majority of local governments in North America, is to really try to find some ways of providing some transparency. There's been some great work that's been done on that. Some sort of lower tech solutions, some higher tech solutions. The internet obviously makes available all sorts of information. Some of it in really easy to digest format, and some of it a little bit harder. But I was really intrigued by some work that was started about a year or so ago by GFOA. The staff member that led that was Mark Mack on the Online Financial Transparency Task Force. And it's a little bit blurred on your screen, but this is it's the first 4 recommendations that are coming out of the Online Financial Transparency Task Force. And the thing that I noted about them is that they're beginning to make a bridge between transparency, or not just a bridge, but they're beginning to say transparency is good, and fortunately, transparency has come an awful long way in North American governments, school districts, et cetera. But there's sort of an additional need, and I would even call it an additional opportunity to add participation to that. And so this should be coming out. From what I understand, this is going through a copy editing process right now at GFOA.
Yeah.
But as you can see, these recommendations are beginning to recommend having interactivity and using simulations, surveys, and feedback mechanisms, and in particular focusing on two-way communication. So it's not just here's our big budget book, go crazy, or even here's just a visualization. See what you can learn, but to actually have conversations and interaction. And we think that that's very useful. Even though part of what's driving the ability to be so transparent is the internet, we are seeing in the second recommendation even talks about using in-person channels as a way to sort of build trust. And once again, the problem there is that budgets remain very hard to talk about, and it's just difficult to get people who don't have this as their day job to find where their place is and where their role is in participating. But also doing things like focusing on context, so providing additional information about what a budget item is, or even a category or a priority, and just really trying to sort of bring people along. And then this last recommendation, there are more recommendations in the report, but this last recommendation has to do with constraints. And it's not just about, how would you spend $100 or how would you, prioritize certain items. It's also about trying to share with them the constraints that you have. And the most obvious constraint that local government has is that you can't spend more money than you have. Almost every local government has a budget. But there's additional constraints too. Sometimes certain revenues can only be used for certain things. Some things are required by law. And so if you can find a way in a sort of a dynamic, interactive, sort of multifaceted way to convey that, our belief is that you actually create the opportunities to build trust, to get input, and maybe even the focus on that most important element of trust, which is building relationships. Could you have the next slide, please?
Right. Yep.
This is one of those magic quadrant exercises, and it's actually, I think it might look a little prettier in the published version, but this was the one that was available, where they just talk about kind of two goals of transparency, and one is to educate and one is to inform. And so the upper left and lower left and lower right, they all talk about different things, but kind of where you want to be is in that upper right, where you can both inform and educate, and talking about this idea of having drillable and searchable data, showing constraints. A lot of the things I just talked to you about, timely data, accurate data, context, all these things are really powerful. If you go to the next slide, sort of independently. So I was fortunate enough to be, I think, one of 4 non-governmental advisors to this Online Financial Transparency Task Force. This is the way that I sort of think about it. I think about it as the 3 C's. and that is that you want to be able to provide to residents or internal stakeholders three things. You want to be able to convey constraints, context, and consequences. And even though the word facilitate means to make easy, I think what you actually want to do is you want to convey to whatever stakeholders or users you have that this is hard. So we sometimes do surveys after people go through simulations. And one of the things that makes me happiest is when they say, gosh, this is really hard. I didn't realize what tough trade-offs our leadership was being asked to make, whether it's elected officials or whether it's professional staff. But if you can use a simulation to bring people into your shoes and really let them know this is incredibly hard to do. And, there's trade-offs, and these are trade-offs that really no human being should have to make. But you know what? We've got some constraints and some constraints we have to meet, and this is all we've got. But once you get to that point of this is hard and having everybody sort of agree that it's hard, that's actually a place where you can create trust. I mean, if people agree that this is hard, you've actually got empathy, and empathy is closely related to trust. And so that can actually be a very powerful thing. Next slide is from, I just sort of like this slide. It sounds better when it's said with a Portuguese accent, but one of the other the Financial Transparency Task Force was this guy named Paulo Dorenzio. He's Brazilian, and he had this lovely little quote where he just said, "Transparency is not enough. Thinking that transparency can have deeper impacts without participation is like thinking that you can make friends simply by waving at your window." It's just a lovely quote. That's how he finished his
great point.
Presentation. Yes, and he's just a smart guy. And we couldn't agree more because transparency is terrific, but it needs to have relationship. And finding to have that relationship is really the key. And I think all the stuff that Matt and Michael have been talking about with trust, that's how you build trust. Next slide, please.
Sure.
So I'm a little bit more from the public participation background than the budget finance background. And there's two really terrific scholars, one at Syracuse University at the Maxwell School named Tina Dabachi and Matt Leininger, who's at Public Agenda. And they wrote a book. Some apologies to them. I've sort of made some adaptations to it, talking about the mindsets that public officials generally often have with regards to participation and transparency. And on the left are sort of some traditional views, and I think kind of the accepted views. And for people that may not have necessarily been exposed to this might be what they just have as a default. But a traditional view. You only provide info that you want people to know. So it's kind of withholding data once again. And the idea of being transparent and participative is you provide as much info as people want. That doesn't mean you don't curate it. You don't just give a big data dump. You don't just say, here's the 2,000-page budget book, but you let people have information without trying to withhold it. And I talk to a lot of budget and finance people in particular, and they hold a lot of data, and sometimes they don't really want to share it. And even though they might be transparent, it's not necessarily sharing data in such a way that it can really be put to use to build that trust that we've been talking about so much in this call. Another one is focusing on your preferred policy option. Instead, you can actually present a wide range of options and be open to new ideas. So one of the things that I found that this is and this has been backed up now by a peer-reviewed research study that was released a few weeks ago at the American Political Science Association, is that when you use a simulation and you've got those three C's, constraints, consequences, and context, that when stakeholders go through those, even if they start with a strong ideological bent one way or the other, after they've gone through the simulation, they've put themselves in your shoes, they've experienced how hard it is, and they actually tend to then mimic what the proposed budget was, unless it was some crazy idea. And so what this tells me is that when you can sort of ground people in facts and let people share the trade-offs, that really the divergence narrows dramatically, and that you don't really need to be so afraid of having other options out there, because there's a reason why in a proposed budget by the chief financial officer, or by the city manager, or by the mayor, or by the superintendent, there's a reason why that proposal is the way it is. Maybe it's not the perfect budget or the wisest in the world, but there's for it. And people tend to, when they have that opportunity, they tend to not be so divergent as people might think. And so sometimes I talk to people that are just very, very afraid of doing public engagement, And what we found is that if you can do it in such a way that people come shoulder to shoulder and can look at a situation, that they tend to actually be pretty decent partners in decision making. So I'm not going to go on to the rest of these, and I'd be glad to share the slides later with folks. But we've just really found that if you can find a way, an honest way, a genuine way to build a relationship, to let people understand that this is a really hard problem that doesn't necessarily have an easy answer, you've then got you've got partners in problem solving.
No, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think kind of the takeaway for me maybe is that transparency is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, right? So it's not just enough to say, oh, look, I've put this data out there. I'm transparent, end of story. It's more, okay, I'm being transparent. That's now the first step towards building better engagement with my community, with my stakeholders, and so on. But again, it's not a means in and of itself where you're just, okay, that's it. I've done. I can check that box. I'm transparent. End of story. Is sort of like, now let's take the next step. And now that we are being transparent, how can we engage with our community better?
Nicely put, very nicely put. And then once you have that relationship, then you can do many more of the hard things that are actually called for in the framework, and some of the hard things that Matt was talking about. If you have a tool to have a conversation during labor negotiations, for example, that's sort of fact-based and so it shows interactions, even though there might be a vast public that agrees that teachers should be paid more, it's actually harder than that because there is a finite amount of money unless voters are willing to vote, more money to go towards this or whatever political mechanism are in charge of revenue. But if you can just find that way to have that conversation in a fact-based way, understand the complexity and have partners, that's powerful. And transparency is a prerequisite, but it's not the end, as you said. Right.
Well, thanks. That is very helpful. And kind of along that same line, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how, using the Financial Foundation framework, what are some ways that budgets can be presented to stakeholders? Again, I totally appreciate the point you made about how, this stuff is complicated. We are the professionals. We understand it very well, but, to some of our constituents and stakeholders out there, this is a little more dense and complicated. So what are your thoughts on presenting the budget?
Yeah, please go to slide 39.
Yeah.
So this article came, I think it came before the Online Financial Transparency Task Force began its most recent round of work. But on the left is an article that was in the Government Finance Review that Mark Mack and I wrote. And it was, I got to tell you, it was just a blast to write this because we got to go through 30 or 40 years of efforts to try to understand what is the right place for residents in the budget process. And there's a great article that was written in 2006 by Carol Ebden and Amy Franklin, and they sort of talked about what had come forward, the 15 or 20 years prior, and they talked about surveys, and they talked about hearings, and they talked about advisory boards, and they talked about, sort of a number of ways to really, convene that conversation with people who are non-professionals, but they were still stakeholders. And they concluded it's pretty tough. And the one thing that they found as a bright spot, but at least in 2006, it wasn't a really good solution, was simulations. And so Wichita, Kansas is an example of a city that they mentioned, I think in 2002, 2003, that had created a simulation on paper and pencil. This was sort of pre-internet being as robust as it is now, and talking about how useful it was. But they also talked about how difficult it was because it required, nearly a 1-to-1 ratio of staff to residents. They did it on a Saturday morning, and they had like 20 staff and like 40 residents.
Yeah.
1-to-2, but just very time intensive, and it really only reached 30 or 40 people in the end. But they did say there's something really promising there that holds a lot of potential. And then the article kind of fast forwards to 2012 when Johnson County, Kansas actually did a really nice sort of online budget simulation. City of Baltimore under Andrew Klein created one. And then the organization that I'm with, we actually created one as well. We created one in 2007 along with Colorado State University for the state of Colorado. And and then it kind of just traces this history of, well, gosh, as the internet has gotten better and better. I mean, what we're doing right now with this WebEx, this webinar, is actually pretty amazing stuff that it wouldn't have been available as robustly 10 or 15 years ago. Well, now some of the things you can do are pretty fascinating with cloud-based software, where you can quickly or relatively quickly make a simulation that conveys constraints, context, and consequences, and lets people experience, the tough trade-offs, gathers input in a way that's dynamic. So it's not just a survey that says, I like all these things and I don't like taxes, which is often what surveys tell you when you're just surveying individual budget items. But the point is that technology has actually made possible what Ebden and Franklin had found years earlier in terms of having simulations. Technology has made it possible to do that in a cost-effective way that can now reach thousands and thousands of people. And so that's kind of the bottom line of this article, and sort of what I see as a potential game changer as a tool that can be helpful in moving forward on any of the pillars in the framework that we've been discussing.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right, too, that the simulations, I think, are the closest way we can get to stepping into somebody else's shoes, which is then in turn how you build that empathy, which is then in turn how you build the trust, right? And so again, you can kind of see how all these things are connected. And you're right, without the technology where it is today, it would be virtually impossible. So we're lucky we have what we do today, and hope it gets better, even better in the future. But let's move on to pillar number 3, which is using collective decision making. And again, I think these things are all so interconnected, right? You can't really engage in collective decision making without first having built up some minimum level of trust and having some minimal communication. So, and then again, hopefully by engaging in the collective decision making, that's sort of even building your trust up even more. So, Matt, I wanted to talk with you, though, for a second, because I think, collective decision-making is great, but it can sometimes lead to sort of groupthink or delays in reaching a decision. I know sometimes we talk about, I've been involved in some organizations that really suffered from what I would call analysis paralysis, right? You're thinking so much and consulting so much that you fail to do anything. So what do you think are some hallmarks of a really effective collective decision-making process?
Well, I think if you can go to slide 22, I think building on what Chris said, the fact that the process really has to engage individuals, and that's what you want. You don't want to just kind of, hang a banner and, say, well, we did it. It's out there. It's available on our website. You can see it right there if you go to it. It really begins, really looking at how you can get the broadest amount of people involved in a decision at the earliest stages. I think that's one of the best practices that if you're looking for additional information on implementing in your own community, that you can, move forward with from, I think it was an article that was done by the Harvard Business Review on collective decision making, and the fact that at the earliest stages you want as many people involved and weighing in on it. That said, I think that you need to look that all decisions are not weighted on an equal level. So I think that you look at the kind of top left, of this, the top quadrant has that you're really looking at small decisions and how, for a small decision you don't want to wait for a large subset of weight in. How do you optimize those? So if you think of as a manager or as a chief official of your area, how you allow those decisions to be, kind of cultivated. Very often, myself, from my experience, I often will run them by individuals. I'll seek different individuals. I'll think of who would give me almost an answer that I want to hear and someone who would say an answer I don't want to hear, to be able to get that perspective in place. So really optimizing those and developing a decision-making, pattern on those decisions. I think the next, quadrant over to the right really looks at, well, the next level is then when you have decisions that, they're not small. They're not easily made. They're not just made out of a discussion. You're really looking at what data or analytics you can have. And maybe for a decision, you don't want to, open up, how much you're going to pay, a group of your workers, increases wise, but you want to use data and analytics to drive that decision as a process. And then also, if you kind of carry this, process through on decision making to, employee compensation. And again, I hit that because it's a very large part of all of our budgets is people and personnel. Then you want to look at the outcomes. So, for example, if we changed the way we, applied, certain positions for, meeting the needs of our organizations, would they help us improve process or flow or efficiency? We just did a whole reworking of our facilities and maintenance division to improve efficiency and outcomes, and we knew that it would cost us more. But we looked at the data of not only what we were proposing, we looked at benchmark data for other organizations. We looked at metrics such as our cleaning, efficiency and turnaround, time from square footage. We then looked at that data from, a square footage example, a number of fixture example. We looked at every possible scenario to make a decision that used, data and analytics that, could drive that and then also get us to a better outcome, which for us, was service, for that. And then I think the final piece is that, from all of those, you as an organization have to make a judgment as to, that what will give you the engagement, what will trigger people, for it. It's almost like this idea of, if you're looking for, feedback, you may have to start to think, 12 months ahead of when you need to make the decision, because you maybe need to start to drop hints with regards to, what is our tolerance for a change to our employee benefits? What is the tolerance for moving forward with an alternative fuel, vehicle program? What is the tolerance for taking out a bond for, improvements in infrastructure, there to kind of gauge, who's there, and then also think often of who's not there, who's not at the table, regarding that decision to draw or offer them in there, because if those who are in the vicinity but not part of that decision are going to eventually complain about the decision, it's kind of easier to manage those from a public organization if those individuals were part of an initial process rather than coming in, after you're already out of the gate.
I wanted to point out something I think you've mentioned a couple times and which I think is really helpful, which is that you've talked about this sort of act of like, as I think about it, it's like priming people, but sort of gauging them early on, like not at the point at which you need a decision today, but kind of, giving them a heads up about it maybe a couple months beforehand to cut, whether, again, this is a stakeholder group or your governing board or whatever, but kind of I think about it as like not keeping them in the dark, right? Like keeping them apprised of sort of those horizon issues. So I think that's also, though, related to this issue of collective decision-making, because it's sort of, it's not just a one-time thing, right? It's like an ongoing process, and you need to kind of keep them apprised of how things are moving so that it's not a surprise to them later, and I think that could have the tendency to, if they're caught off guard, if you're any given stakeholder group is caught off guard, I feel like that can erode a little bit of trust. So I again, it was something I picked up on a couple times that you'd said about, keeping them apprised of the issue and kind of gauging their tolerance for certain things. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, that, and then just one more sentence, to build on what Michael and Chris have said as well, the fact that, if constituents aren't dealing with these decisions on a daily basis, to just say to them, here's our options, what do you want to do here, is so much to digest. So if you really can think about that and break it down into pieces to try to, again, it gives you the selfish ability to see what's the interest here. If you get if I get shut down talking about just moving to a formulary program for my prescription, I know that's going to be an uphill battle. If I put that out there and I start to talk about it and I don't get questions, then I know that can gauge. But then I also get, that other feedback, from that, through the process. And also I know people talk. So I know the 3 people who maybe were at the meeting the time I talked about that are going to talk to their friends, and then it's going to start to get through, for that and be more manageable to further address and respond to.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Michael, I'd like to get your thoughts on something. I think sometimes in government, I talked about this earlier, it's like we have a tendency to use what I call the traditional public hearing model for public engagement. And so, maybe we post some information on a website, we circulate a flyer, we say, we're holding a hearing this day. But then we get sort of frustrated because no one shows up to engage with us. We're like, well, we put it out there, but what strategies, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about some strategies that Mecklenburg County has used to engage with, and to market its public engagement opportunities.
Certainly. I want to begin with slide 25.
Sure. Oh, I like this one, yes.
And this here it's a table that was designed by the International Association for Public Participation. It's something that we came across. Mecklenburg County, to be quite frank with you all, is new to this public engagement space. It's not that we overlooked it. However, there just wasn't a strong interest with our governing body and some of our leadership to be in public engagement as strong as we are now. But again, this table was developed by the International Association for Public Participation. The model is called the Inform to Empower Public Participation Spectrum and can be used when devising an engagement strategy. You simply begin by understanding what the goal of your engagement strategy is, and that ranges whether simply providing information which would be on the far left or placing decision-making power in residents' hands, which is on the far right, or of course somewhere in between. And then after you determine your goals, you can work, down the examples of what specific actions you can take to accomplish them. So just beginning with that first row, public participation goal, you have inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And relative to inform, to provide the public with objective information to assist them in understanding the problems, alternatives, and solutions. So again, going back earlier to when I say don't only just state the problem, but come up with solutions as well. Then oftentimes, of course, you want to seek that consultation. You want to obtain their feedback on analysis, alternatives, and decisions that have been made by the organization, or involve them. Work directly with the public to ensure concerns are consistently understood and considered, or collaborate to partner with the public in each aspect of decision-making, including the development of alternatives and solutions, and of course, empower. This is placing the funding decisions in the hands of the public. A good example of this is participatory budgeting, which I will share in another example later in this presentation. So after you define your goal, then you want to settle on your promise to the public. And that is where you keep them informed. We will keep you informed, listen, and acknowledge your concerns and provide feedback that closes the loop. Will you work to ensure your concerns are reflected in alternatives? We'll look to you, the public, for advice and innovation and incorporate the recommendation in your decisions. And then, again, the empowerment, that's implementing the decisions that were made from the community that you serve. And then that last row has some examples. If you can then advance to slide 26. This here is a pyramid spectrum. And just starting from the bottom, working my way up to the pyramid, at the base, you're reaching beyond the self-selectors, so bringing more voices to the table. Oftentimes, you have groups that are always active and very engaged in activities and opportunities that are provided by your organization, but you want to hear from everyone. So you want to understand who's missing and identify strategies and targets to include them. And then that next step is the lower barriers to entry. So make sure that you're being very accessible. For example, don't only just have your public meetings during the day, at 3 o'clock when folks are at work, but you want to have a variety of activities in the evenings during the weekend or even on weekends, Saturday mornings. Capture and analyze, view the complete picture, whether it's meetings online, social media, email, paper, bring it all together. And then one of the most important ones to me is closing the loop. And this is something that we're intending to put a strong emphasis on, is after we receive all this feedback, we want to make sure that we follow back up and report out as it relates to how we factor the information that we receive during those engagement activities. And then, of course, the tip of the pyramid, which is one of the pillars, is building trust. That public trust being the goal and the foundation of democratic governance. So regarding the public hearing model, of course, the public hearing in most, if not all, jurisdictions is a requirement. It's something that we are required to have, at least here in the state of North Carolina. And one of the things that we did with that model, and it was a quick win, was we decided to have 2 public hearings. There was a notion in our community that some perceive that the budget is half-baked, once the public hearing occurs. Decisions have already been made, so why are you seeking my feedback? What's the likelihood that you'll make significant changes to what is being recommended to the governing body for consideration? So what we decided to do was to go back, and you can advance the slide to the next slide. Yes.
Yep.
We decided to implement a public hearing prior to our board retreat, which occurs in January. We're on a July to June fiscal year, and the board budget retreat is held in January. So we had a public hearing that preceded that retreat. It was about a couple of weeks in advance so that they can receive citizens' feedback prior to the retreat, and they factor that as part of the prioritization exercise that was facilitated at that retreat. So they, county staff summarized the feedback, we presented it at the retreat, and they factored that as part of their prioritization exercise, and there was some commonalities in the end result of what our board ranked as their high priorities in comparison to what the public provided them at that public hearing. So going back, as I stated earlier, that Mecklenburg County is fairly new to public engagement. The reason why is we had a new board that was seated this past December, and they ran on a platform that they wanted to increase public engagement. So typically, all public engagement activities should begin in the fall. Well, because it was November, December, we were close to our budget cycle, we had to take a modified approach. So the approach that we took was as listed on this slide. We came up with our resident work sections, focus groups, prioritization exercise, a budget simulator, as well as an online survey. We can go to the next slide.
Yep.
So I labeled this slide as 1.0 because it is a multi-approach phase. The modified approach being listed here, and then the more robust approach is what we're rolling out for this next budget cycle. But given we only had about 45 days to put some model together, we focus on these 3 activities here. One, we sent letters to all of our advisory boards asking them to share with us their priorities and what would they like for the manager and the board to factor in terms of prioritization. And then again, as I mentioned, we had a public hearing in advance of kicking off our budget, and then also the residents' budget survey. Next slide. Of course, to pull this off, it was very important that we had a strong marketing strategy in place. Here are some of the steps that we took to roll out and advertise and raise awareness about our engagement activities. We had a media communications campaign. We used online communication mediums to announce the launch of our survey. Also, the public hearing, we posted on our website, had news releases. We used our social media platform to announce the launch of the survey. as well as the public hearing, and we used targeted media pitches to specific local broadcasts and radio and print media to secure positive interviews. And I tell you, they were very receptive. You know, we've conducted several news interviews at our local news stations, discussing our public engagement model. So they helped us get the word out because it was an opportunity to hear from our residents. Next slide. So here's a summary of our budget survey. The survey went live on January 2nd, so it was about 3 weeks. And just as context, our board retreat was held on, I believe, January 23rd. The methodology was electronic and a paper survey. You got to have paper survey because everyone does not have access to technology. You talk about the digital divide. The paper surveys were placed at our local park and recreation centers, as well as our library branches, and at the budget public hearing that we had in January as well. It was published in English and Spanish, and we had a total of 1,600 responses. Next slide. Here's a summary of those responses. We had a total of 1,636, of which about 1,300 of them were online, and the balance was paper surveys.
Great.
Regarding the demographic information, as you can see here, we have the respondents identify their race, ethnicity, and then they identified their priorities. And these are the categories that are listed here: education, health and human services, housing, so forth and so on. And just imagine an electronic survey where they have the opportunities to just click and drag and put them in order based on their priorities from 1 to 8. And we took that information, we compiled it, and we presented it at our retreat. Next slide. More demographic information, the age, and then the next slide, the breakdown of, again, the race and ethnicity. One of the things that we also want to make sure is that we had a good representation of the demographic population in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. As you can see, we're slightly off. The table on the right, that's the actual percentage breakdown by race for our community. And then the table on the left and the percentage column, that provides the actual results. So we have a little work that we need to do going into the next iteration of this process. Next slide. Next slide.
Sorry about that.
Okay. And then here is another example of a question that we asked from the list of services below. How would you allocate $100? So we just asked them to just, imagine they have $100 and then tell us how they would spend that $100. And as you see, education bubbled up as one of the top priorities, the top priority, and so forth and so on. So we took that information, we analyzed it, and we presented the results from our survey along with the feedback that we got from the hearing, as well as the responses from our advisory committees. We briefed our board at their retreat in January on all this additional information that we gathered that is the voice of the community. And then they factored that as part of the prioritization exercise. So that was the abbreviated approach that we took for fiscal year 20.
Great. Thank you for walking us through that. I think it was very helpful and kind of gave us some, idea of how it could work. And I think the fact that, again, you were able to do this on an abbreviated timeline, too. You still, even, that the new council kind of came in, I think you said in, January or December, right? That it's still, you were still able to kind of get it all done. So I think gives us gives people a framework that they could follow, an example. Chris, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about some other tools or strategies that local government leaders can use to better understand stakeholder priorities. So Michael kind of just talked about this allocation exercise. Are there other examples that you can share with us about ways that they can get a better idea of what stakeholder priorities are?
Yeah, absolutely, and there's actually been a lot of research on this. If you could go to slide 47, please.
Sure.
And I just want to acknowledge, Michael, what you did in short order sounds monumental. To have had 2 or 3 or 4 significant outreach activities is remarkable, especially in that short amount of time. Just parenthetically, after the Great Recession, ICMA did a study to try to correlate, to try to understand how local governments were dealing with the aftermath of the Great Recession. And what they found was that they were able to find a positive correlation between local governments that did 1, 2, 3, or 4 different types of activities. It didn't matter too much what the activity was, but just that local government leadership was making an effort to engage the public, correlated with how successfully they navigated the downturn. And so the things that you're talking about, Michael, are and so I say that in the context of talking about kind of what's next. And I will note, just for everyone, Mecklenburg County is one of our most recent clients in terms of using the budget simulation. And Michael, I'll just tell you, your staff has been keeping us on our toes. They are really pushing the bounds of the tool with how ambitious they are in terms of how they want to use it. It's actually been a pleasure to work with them, and we're looking forward to seeing what Mecklenburg County's 2.0 version looks like, and really partnering with you on that. But one of the things, I kind of mentioned this before, is that there's been some good research that shows that surveys are of limited value. Not that they have no value, but they're of limited value in terms of understanding budget priorities, and that's because typically almost everyone on a survey gives a thumbs up to services, and typically they either give a thumbs down or kind of like a 50-50. I'm okay with my tax structure the way it is. And so, finding a way to have it be more interactive is really a critical thing. I already talked about the three C's. Another thing that we found that really helps when you're trying to engage people in the budget is to make things realistic, and in particular, to attach cost effects. And so, I sort of glibly sometimes just talk about, well, people love the fire department and they also love the fireworks display on the 4th of July. And those two things have dramatically different costs. And if you're surveying people, which ones do you love the most? Both those might get like 99% or something like that. But it is important to sort of, provide cost effects and kind of play it out a little bit more. Once again, making it, a somewhat realistic exercise. It doesn't have to be real, because otherwise they would become the budget director, and most of them don't want to do that. But trying to find a way to make it realistic. And this last thing is what we found to be really key, is to show interactions among spending items. And what social scientists sort of believe are the most useful way of understanding what priorities is what they call revealed preferences. So if residents had an opportunity to just kind of learn about the totality of what government is doing, what would they do and how would they allocate it, including the cost effects of doing various things, and including the constraints and revenue options that you have. So if you go to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
When we started doing budget simulation, we really had a conundrum to deal with because we were gathering an immense amount of data, just so much data, and we didn't know exactly what to do with it. And so we worked with some folks to come up with a way of visualizing it. And so what we've come up with is a way of kind of demonstrating the interactivity of things. And so this slide shows the spending side for sort of a medium-sized Midwestern city. It's not super secret. I'm not going to say their name. But it talks about how they, sort of responded. This was an early on budget simulation when there was kind of a lot of things sort of up in the air. And what they found was that people were really quite keen on increasing some spending in culture and recreation. They had a big issue with a civic center that they were trying to decide as a community what to do with, and they found through this that people really wanted to have some expansion. So that's why you see the top indicator up there going far to the right. But then what I love though is that they also keep themselves honest, or at least if you structure the conversation right, you can't just have spending without some type of an offsetting decrease or a tax increase or revenue increase of some kind. And so what's nice about this is that residents held themselves accountable. So they said, yes, we really want to spend more on culture and recreation. We've got a little bit more of an interest in spending money on streets and infrastructure, if you look about 2/3 down there. But then on these other items, they're willing to have some minor cuts. Now, if I would show you the next graph, I don't have it on a slide, you'd also see that in order to pay for this extended spending on their civic center, they also were willing to increase taxes to a corresponding level so that they could actually balance a budget with you. So what we're finding is that the input that residents can give you and stakeholders can give you, once again, doesn't replace the professional judgment, the analysis, the interpretation that you all have as financial professionals and budget professionals, nor the legal authority that elected officials have to ultimately make a judgment about what to include, what not to include, and what levels. But having this type of directional input can be really useful to understand what people's revealed preferences are, not just what they say they like and what they say they don't like.
Sure. Excuse me. So, Chris, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how local government leaders can engage internal stakeholders and elected officials.
Yes, if you could go to slide 51. This is one of my favorite topics right now, it wasn't something that we really anticipated working on when we started with our current initiative 4 or 5 years ago. We thought that this would be sort of a civic tool that would be used to bring residents and taxpayers into constructive conversation with local government, but we've been incredibly happily surprised to see how useful, once again, if you have the ability to kind of quickly and easily and inexpensively, make a budget simulation, how well it can actually facilitate a positive conversation internally, and really how right. needed it was. And so, finding a way to use the structure of the conversation to get, these conversations can be really useful. I've been having some conversations with the National League of Cities about, what is that role for elected officials in the budget? And what we found is that there's usually two extremes, that an elected official gets all riled about one particular item and just zeroes in on it. Maybe it's a quarter-time FTE or a small program, and, that is just the priority and won't stop talking about it until he or she gets what she wants. So that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is that an elected official just, fine, just pass it. They get the big budget book and they don't really know what their role is, so they just say fine. And we're sort of saying, there's a golden mean in there where you can actually, once again, frame that conversation, use to try to, find a facilitation tool to talk about the budget that can actually focus people on the trade-offs where they actually need to have some input. So once again, they don't need to become budget and performance analysts. They need to understand what their role is, and if you can find a tool to do that, that can be really useful. And then right. the other thing we're finding is reducing internal budget friction by having department heads and even employees generally to understand the totality of what the local government is trying to do. And in some ways, let's just be honest, a department head might very well be a very good department head because he or she is an awesome advocate in the budget process for his or her department. In a way, that's kind of good, right? Because you want them to advocate for the department. But in fact, what the local government is trying to do is not just have one department that gets everything it wants. And so what we found is that if you can engage people in conversations, even if they're advanced stakeholders like department heads, in having that conversation and learning about, the interactions and learning about, what the Parks and Rec department is trying to do with youths and learning about what the police department is trying to do with youths, that you can actually have a really different kind of conversation and reduce some friction. One of my favorite quotes comes from a vice chancellor of a big university that convened a big meeting of department heads, and afterwards, the dean of the School of Engineering came up to him and said, I really wanted that lab, but you know what? I understand why the humanities building needs to have a new HVAC system, and I still want that lab, but I actually understand why that's a higher priority in this year's budget.
Right,
and so
right.
nobody got what they, he didn't get what he wanted. This dean didn't get what he wanted, but he's actually okay with the decision that was made. If you go to the next slide, these are some quotes. I think it's, I'm not sure how it's going to show up. Okay. If you could see behind the yellow boxes, you'd see 400 staff members learning about the budget, interacting on the budget, and having a conversation about it. This was an all-hands meeting. This is for a large community health center. And the CEO wanted all 400 staff members from all different departments at the all-hands meeting to weigh in on the 7 or 8 big budget choices for the next year. And these are some quotes that they got. So the VP for Finance says, "We want people to understand the why. This was a great introduction to the types of choices that need to be made. Often staff simply say they want money for something new, that we need to hire another person, etc. But what they don't understand, but they don't understand the impact of the entire organization and why we can't just do that." I hear that so many times from budget directors is people don't understand why we can't just do that. Just give me an FTE, let's do this program. Right. And then is actually from, some kind of, from participants who are not at the level of the VP, but finding this way to have participation, you can actually build consensus that can be really powerful towards, meeting your mission, meeting the priorities of the city. I love what Matt said. There's 4 goals. I mean, what if you actually created, a conversation among staff and employees, and especially in the school district among teachers, about how should we organize our budget if these are our 4 goals, and how can we do this in the smartest way possible to meet these 4 goals?
No, I completely agree, and I think again, like I keep talking about both the internal and the external, and I'm glad you brought this up, that the internal conversations are very important, and these budget simulations can be helpful not only in talking with the public, but also with your elected officials and your internal folks, and decreasing that budget friction. And we have kind of similar to the story you just shared about the trade-off between the lab and the HVAC system. We have an example in the book, and I can't remember the jurisdiction, but it was after engaging in kind of the same sort of a similar type of information sharing and putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, it was either a sheriff or a police chief advocating for why his department shouldn't get more money and instead they should give it to another department. And, like completely unheard of, right? Like no public safety agency ever argues for getting less money. But I want to say it was like he was advocating for the money to instead go to like a human services type program, because he was like, no, that'll be better spent there. And, if our goal is X, that this money will still serve a better purpose over there. And I think, without these kinds of conversations taking place, that won't happen, right? So I'm glad you pointed out some tools and how these simulations can be useful in that regard.
Good example.
We are running short a little bit on time, so I think we're going to have a quick conversation about some shared services, and then might have to move to some questions. But we are just having lots of great conversations, so I really do want to thank you all. But Matt, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about shared services. So, right, we talked about as it relates to collective decision-making, not only the engagement but and the collective choice arrangements, but we also talked about those networked enterprises earlier, which again is sort of shared services and joining forces with other departments or organizations. And they often are a solution to budget issues, but how can the use of shared services be integrated into your organization as more than just a budget relief? What are some other ways?
Sure, Kate. So if you go to slide 23,
sure.
Just kind of summarize some ideas for thinking of shared services. What is your mission? What is your mission and core, and how can that be an opportunity to provide those services to other organizations? So for example, we provide business services back office wise to other school entities in our area because we do them very well. We have a proven track record with it, and it's an opportunity for revenue for us as well as for smaller entities to receive, consistent and reliable, financial services. I think you also look at shared services as an opportunity to ensure that your practices are consistent. Very often that those can allow you to see, where you maybe veer from a norm, where you maybe could do better. And of course, shared services are, economies of scale for costs. But then also, again, when you think of decision making, the more, shared service, affiliations you may be involved with, there can be the opportunity for feedback on decision making, a better understanding of what goes on. I know that I serve on a utility purchasing group, and I have learned more about that, which is not a core function of my organization, but a procurement that I'm engaged with from that, there, and that in turn, it's not necessarily for me, improved user experience, but I've definitely improved our entities, utilization of best energy efficient ASHRAE, products out there to, improve our operation and, efficiency, through that, that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I think kind of the finer piece is, again, to look at, your system, and that shared services can be a way to improve areas of weakness, or, also to reevaluate how you as an organization are functioning, and either let go of, a task or function that may not be, area focused, or to gain an increased focus on where something matters.
Well, yeah, no, thank you for sharing that with us. I think that's spot on there. We are going to shift very quickly to a couple questions. We have to do a couple knowledge check-ins. So question number 3, quick one, true or false, collective decision-making, which we've talked a lot about, should be limited to the financial team. True or false? Take a couple seconds and give us your answer there. Okay, the poll closed. Let's see what you all said. So just in case, so the answer here, this is false, just so we're clear. Collective decision-making should not just be limited to the financial team, and I hope that came across in our discussion, that really this should be, oh, yay, 79% of you answered false. So that is right. We want this to be really broad and include as many stakeholders as possible. I'm going to go through the rest of our questions really quickly just so we ensure we get those in. Let's see. Question number 4. Which of the following is not one of the pillars of the Financial Foundations Framework? A, use collective decision-making. B, create clear rules. C, build a budget book. D, treat everyone fairly. Or E, establish a long-term vision. So which of these is not a pillar? Take a couple seconds there. Okay, you guys did great. The correct answer is C, build a budget book. That is not a pillar. So we like budget documents, but that is not one of the pillars. So this next one, we talked about this very early on, is what is one way to create clear rules in your organization? So we What did we talk about? Develop and implementing financial policies, requiring staff to wear name tags, engaging and encouraging micromanagement, or D, producing a CAFR. So what is one way to create clear rules? Take a couple seconds there. Okay, again, you guys did great. Most, 70% of you answered A, develop and implement financial policies, and that is exactly right. Under pillar number 4, we talk about well-defined boundaries, and those boundaries are often set through your financial policies. And finally, for question number 6, this is a true or false. So we talked about this very briefly again at the beginning, but moving away from use it or lose it budgeting is one way to remove barriers to doing the right thing. Do we think that's true or false? Excuse me. Okay, the poll's closed. This is true. So I haven't seen all what the final calculations were, but moving away from use it or lose it budgeting, which I think is very common in most of our organizations, right? Use those funds or else they're going to get swept at the end of the year. Yeah, and the majority of you answered true, so good job. Moving away from that and finding a different way to work with your department heads would be one way to remove a barrier to doing the right thing. Again, we have a few minutes left here. I just wanted to reach out to Matt, Chris, and Michael and see if you had any closing words, advice to folks, any tips. You know, I think particularly if we're dealing with colleagues or management who aren't receptive to this kind of approach, anything that you could share, that would be appreciated. I don't know if anyone has any, again, final thoughts that they'd like to share with the group.
This is Matt. I guess in the management being receptive piece as a final thought for me, that working in a number of different organizations, it does have to be the right time for your organization. You cannot force something on there, but that said, I think you could maybe look for components to begin to implement. So, you know, again, we talk about these levels of engagement and, you know, utilize these pillars as, you know, starting points for you to, you know, if you can't full on out, you know, kind of implement to implement gradually and, you know, see if that kind of can prove itself to potentially be an avenue for interest in more. That's my take.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Michael or Chris, I don't know if you had any final comments that you wanted to add.
Well, for me, this is Michael. Based on our experiences with some of these items, I just would say you're talking about change management. And anytime you're making a shift and you're changing, it can be very uncomfortable for some, particularly when they're accustomed to doing things for a certain way, by a certain way for a long period of time. So just make sure that you're open to that, that you're factoring that as you're rolling out these new initiatives, these practices, that is new, that it can result in some discomfort for those, but you have to make sure that everyone is open-minded and on board with what you're trying to do.
Sure, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Then, Chris, I didn't know if you had any final thoughts you wanted to add.
Sure. Just briefly, I like that last point on the slide that you're showing, become a leader in public finance. This is awfully important stuff, and, sometimes the time isn't right, and there are, more propitious times than others to start, but it's awfully important stuff, and at some point there I think will be an economic downturn that that local governments in particular will really have to deal with, and to the degree that you can begin to go down this road, whether it's a small step or a larger step, I think that will bode well for having a strong financial future. So thanks to everyone for participating, being concerned about this.
Yeah, thank you very much for all three of the panelists. I greatly appreciate it. I think we heard a lot from you guys and appreciate hearing about your experiences and sharing that with us. So thank you very much. I just want to wrap up very quickly with a couple of things. We have our book, Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities, will be available very soon. It's currently being printed, so it should be available on our website very soon, so be on the lookout for that. Contact us at GFOA with any questions, comments, or success stories. We want to hear from you. I think one of the best ways to kind of share and get this to spread is really to hear how other people are making it work in their community. So we're trying to gather more white papers and success stories. So if you have any of those, please reach out to me. Again, my name's Katie Ludwig. I'm kludwig@gfoa.org. And then just as if you're interested in this and want to learn more, we are offering a new course, a training course, a one-day training course in Austin in December that is called Improving Your Budget Process with the Financial Foundations Framework. So if you're interested or want to maybe send some of your staff, that's maybe something you want to take a look at. So thank you again very much. I appreciate all our presenters, and have a great day. Take care.